Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast. And today, in an episode I initially had entitled as Technocrats of Duskvol, Charles Siegel and I are going to talk about single session stories, mission-based play, and other things we learn from Blades in the Dark. Charles, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm going to go with presentable. I am glad that we finally get to talk about Blades in the Dark. I needed to do one of those. In my past Blades group that went through the Panzerati, we had a rule that whenever you said Blades in the Dark, it had to be yelled as if it was part of a 80s rock metal anthem. And I would like to do Titterpig Local 491, proud by that. That was the name of the group. They worshipped something like Cthulhu, but they were also one of the only cults in Duskvol that was also a union. So, yeah, reasonably good pay, mandatory overtime periodically, but yeah, they covered their workers.
And it definitely has the right vibe for Blades in the Dark. If nothing else, then you can't get that much more metal than a city that's protected by basically sheet lightning.
Mm-hmm. Because the sun has exploded and the barrier between the living and the dead is gone. As you do.
This whole game is basically a metal album cover.
Yes, Dishonored, the metal album cover. I find it fascinating that this is a heavy homage to Dishonored, which eventually produced a Dishonored Titterpig, which is a heavy homage to Blades in the Dark. So I'm...
How RPGs are sometimes.
Yes. So what is Blades in the Dark? Let's get into it. Blades in the Dark is a fantasy tabletop game that was produced by John Harper, which takes place in a roughly 19th century urban fantasy setting, except with ghosts, electroplasmic demon blood, and lots of mushrooms.
So basically it's Victorian Mage.
It is something like Victorian Mage, except you are given information on how to actually play the factions, except for you can play the game out of it.
I promise not to take too many shots at Victorian Mage. There are parts of that book that I really like. Yeah.
So Blades in the Dark came out in 2015 and was the first game in the Forged in the Dark system. This is considered to be a heavy iteration on Powered by the Apocalypse games. It is notable for having just 12 stats that kind of cover everything. You are rolling 6-sided dice and generally taking the highest or shared highest roll. The thing I like about it is the rules are available under Creative Commons, and every game should do this with their core system. I don't know why there isn't a CC SRD for StoryPath, just to let people kind of go nuts with it. The game is notable for a few things. Players always get to say no to something. It is almost impossible to force a result on a player. They always in some way have the ability to refuse an action that occurs to them. That refusal may come at a cost. For instance, there is no way for the person running the game to killing of characters. And likewise, with the results of almost any roll can be resisted by their characters. The system, the setting, and the mood and design goals all strongly reinforce each other in a way that I think kind of only the best and worst games do. It is very hard to separate the systems from the setting, so whenever we talk about system or setting, that is just kind of an arbitrary line. For instance, Harper didn't want murdering everyone to be a viable option, so if you kill someone in the course of a score, you generate heat, a stat that tracks how much the Duskvol cops, the Bluecoats, kind of want to bust down on you. Heat is generated narratively because when someone dies, their spirit is loosed, causing a set of bells to ring and crows to fly to your location so a group of electroplasmic priests can dissolve the body before their ghost is freed. The systems of the game also often make it about resource management and allow for easy abstraction. Favor with a group can be turned into improved position with them, can be increased by spending downtime with them, by spending gold, by exerting stress, all sorts of ways. And likewise, that contact with the group can be used to avoid a hazardous situation, get a loan providing temporary coin, and such. I personally have played dozens of sessions of Blades in the Dark across several campaigns. I love the game. It's great.
I personally have played 0 sessions of Blades in the Dark. I read the book last week, and there's a lot to like here.
What was your thought about the kind of the package overall, like as it was presented as a game book? Did you find it readable? Do you feel that it sold you on a game and a setting?
It really runs into the problem for me that a lot of games do, especially with modern RPG trends, where I tend to be a big sandbox kind of person, and this game is much more focused than I tend to prefer my games. But that means that when my games shift into the mode that this game is good for, I'm going to borrow a lot. But my games are just generally not going to be as structured as Blades in the Dark wants a game to be. Yeah, that's not a knock on Blades in the Dark. It's just personal preference. Blades in the Dark doesn't really want you to ask questions like, If going outside the city is that dangerous that you need a lightning sheet to keep all the demons out, how do they farm?
Oh, that is mostly done via electroplasmic farms. They are subterranean. There's an entire district of Duskvol where they do that kind of mostly off of hagfish and mushrooms. There's also some kind of fish processing. It is questionable because you're not sure what's a fish and what's secretly a demon. But there are a few essays in the book that try and address that, but kind of vast underground mushroom farms.
Well, I know what my next cults project is going to be.
I similarly have a lot of questions about how the setting works, and I was pleased that there is kind of like this Duskvol expanded cinematic universe that consists of like forum posts that people have said, and periodically John Harper going, yeah, sounds good, kind of.
This is canon now.
Yep. Someone put out just an enthusiast guide to kind of like a Peterson's guide, which is a book that exists for Call of Cthulhu of various types of monsters. Someone just came up with their own, and John Harper's like, yep, that's canon now. So I'm like, oh, wow. These are the amazing things you can do when you have basically one author. Let's talk about the things we liked from the setting. Charles, was there anything that you particularly liked about kind of the setting and the way the world was set up?
The setting is very good at focusing the play in the direction that the mechanics want the play to be. Like as I said, I tend to play expansive sandbox games. This game says if you leave the city, you basically instantly die. So you can't hide. You can't hide outside the city, which again ties into that heat mechanic Terry mentioned. That's how much the cops want you. How tightly integrated everything is to me both a strength and a weak. Like it's a strength for the game as a game. It's a weakness for if this game isn't exactly what you want to do, it's going to be a lot of extra work to pick it apart and figure out how to take pieces without taking the parts you don't want.
I like the fact that the setting as given, everyone is part of a group. There are very few people that are powerful enough to be sole actors in the world. Your power frequently comes from the fact that you are the head of a gang or a blue coat regiment, or you do something with the Imperial Navy, or you're the head of a church. There are comparatively few people who are sufficiently wealthy to kind of stand on their own. The other thing I like about the setting is it provides justification, as Charles mentioned, for a lot of the mechanical things. It wants the city to be a bit of a pressure cooker, so it makes it hard to leave the city without you having a good narrative reason and an ability to withstand the rigors of the areas between the cities where you would constantly have to deal with roaming demon bands because the barrier between the living and the dead has been destroyed in an experiment centuries ago which shattered the sun. And that's just a good line to say. I think it does a good job of kind of saying that there are weird things in this setting, mostly because there are weird arcane sciences. There's not a lot of proper magic. Everything weird happens because you are interacting with the ghost field, which is, again, the thing that happened when the barrier between the living and the dead exploded centuries ago in the experiment that destroyed the sun. There are weird properties of demon blood, and that is kind of your generic MacGuffin.
This game really does need like a shorthand for experiment that destroyed the sun.
Yeah.
This comes up a lot.
Operation Soul Kaboom, yeah. Magical power comes from interacting with the ghost field. Demon blood, or something kind of between the two. There's a little bit of extra arcane physics and so on, and that I kind of like. It never really goes full-on spellcaster wizard magic. All of your magic users are a little off-kilter, and the game very much directs you in that once you kind of gain some of these arcane powers, it really inclines you towards using them, but at a certain cost, which I love because I've never had someone who was an arcane character who didn't immediately go kind of batshit with it. And once you can summon lightning in this setting, there's a lot of problems you decide can be solved by summoning lightning. So, as happens in a lot of games.
Look, when you buy a new hammer, suddenly you find out that a lot of your problems can be solved by hitting them hard with a hammer. You're not stupid. You don't think that everything's a nail, but sometimes it's just a skull.
It's also one of those things where you can't verify that the hammer really works until you level a house with it. It's also kind of one of those things. That's kind of the setting. The other thing I like about the setting is it gives you a whole bunch of playable cultures and so on, which are 1 or 2 sentence descriptions. This group is kind of associated with. This is where they come from. Play me if you're interested in playing the outsider, the survivor, the people on their home turf, the group that is being passed by another culture or what have you. And it gives you a bunch of names. So if you want to play an Acrosan, here's 30 Acrosan names. If you want to play an Aruvian, here's 30 Aruvian names. If you want to play someone from the Dagger Islands, here's 30 Dagger Island names.
Every game that has a setting that is not Earth in the 21st century should do that. It should be really mandatory. And I'm not going to name names Exalted, but...
So let's talk kind of what we like about the systems. Just kind of a pre-note. One of the reasons I frequently like talking about adding new systems is Travis Legg created the dictum of always try and create a system which changes the fewest moving parts of the game to get where you want it to go, which I now call Legg's Maxim.
I think we should call it Legg's Minimum.
Reasonable. Yes. The other key thing is once you introduce a new mechanic that has a new name to it, you get to dissociate all of the baggage that comes with if you were to change another mechanic. So to me, these are kind of two things that fight. For instance, friend of the show, Chaz K, finds that when running Exalted, people are hesitant to use willpower, even though willpower in Exalted is intended to go up and down a lot more than it does in World of Darkness games that also have a willpower statistic. So it's almost one of those things where if it were called might or personal reserves or something like that, or just even will, then you would get to free yourself of the baggage. I find that powerful in that if you introduce a new track and you just don't call it willpower, you don't bring the associations with it.
To talk about personal experience, just even a very small change to something, if you keep the name, can throw off players for, like, I remember right when Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition came out, how many people were annoyed and confused when armor class started getting better when it was big.
Mm-hmm. Likewise, some games are roll under, other games are roll over, and it's like, this is a difficulty 99. Wait, does that mean I have a 1 in 100 chance of getting it, a 2 in 100 chance of getting it, or the opposite? So yeah, it took me a while with the Modifius games, the 2d20s, to be like, low is good. And you see like a pair of 20s and you're like, oh dip.
I had to sit down and do the statistics out because this game uses maximum instead of counting successes. Mm-hmm. But it's a dice pool game. Maximum changes the rolling a lot compared to just counting how many are above a threshold. And like Blades in the Dark wants you to do things and World of Darkness wants you to fail at things. That's not even controversial. World of Darkness is a horror game. If you succeed at everything, there's not really much horror left. Blades in the Dark, while the setting has a lot of horror elements, isn't a horror game, really.
It's a game of scrappy daring in a suspenseful place, in a suspenseful pressure cooker of a city. So to me, the core thing about this game, and kind of the contrivance where I'm like, hey, Charles, you want to talk about this, is the idea of the score. The game assumes that each session, that the basic unit of play consists of kind of a minimum of 3 things, which is the score, the notional goal of the setting. You kidnap the person, you get the piece of information, you steal the artifact, you send the warning, you rescue the princess, whatever. And that is done via roleplay generally. You have some sort of downtime where your character gets to carry on their other agenda. They get to count their coin, they get to recover and blow off stress and so on, or work on long-term projects. And a complication. The characters are a bunch of scoundrels and trouble will just kind of find them. You can kind of ignore the downtime and the complications if you really have to. So it's a case of, on average, a session will have each of these. There are a few other optional moves that can occur as part of a game session. One is faction moves, where the world shifts around you, where the various other players in the city, the other gangs, the other neighborhoods, and the other entities work on their long-term goal. Additionally, there can be a preparation and pre-engagement activity. The game wants you to jump into action as quickly as possible. The first roll of the session is frequently the engagement roll, which tells you how the first action in the game went. You give the storyteller a vague idea of the approach that you gave, you roll dice, and then you come up with what you had decided to do and what happened. And boy howdy, does this kind of start the game off with a bang.
Yeah, very few games encourage sort of this almost in media res starting. Like for most games, and you've got the standard Dungeons and Dragons, you meet in a tavern. You've got mage games where you just have to figure out, oh crap, how do these characters even know each other? Where are they getting together? I hope someone bought a Dot of the Chantry background because that makes my life easier. Things like that. And then in Blades in the Dark, it's, okay, you're all at the table, roll for initiative.
The nice thing about it is that this structure makes it so that the group of people that you kind of start a session with will finish out that little segment of a story arc, unless someone has to leave kind of in the middle of a game. So if someone is absent, they simply miss that cycle of activity. Maybe they're working on other projects, or they have made a poor choice in dealing with stress and are just kind of strung out for a session. There's no need to explain why someone's character is otherwise missing, and cancellations become less impactful. Blades in the Dark, I had 5 people in the group. We could run it with 2 that were still there. Frequently with 2, we would just, the 3 of us would then just play Fiasco or something like that. But I absolutely love a game that is fault tolerant in terms of who can't show up. Blades is intended to be done in 2 to 4 hour chunks, which encourage stories that can be done in 2 to 4 hour chunks. I personally feel my mage games improved when I switched to this mentality. It requires thinking of most stories happening within a place, as the structures break down if the characters are away from whatever their home area is for an extended period of time. But I prefer more single session games. The regular downtime also gives you a lot of room to explain what your character is doing, maintain contact with the mortal world, their mortal communities, express how they work with their magic. So it makes it so that roughly half of what a character does narratively isn't with their core group or party. So the downtime portion of a game session out of 3 or 4 hours of play may only be 20 or 30 minutes, but within game, it can be just as important as you say, hey, I'm going to use this time to rebuild my grandfather's pocket watch, or I'm going to support this homeless shelter that is important to me, or attend and promote this church that is integral to my paradigm, or something like that.
The very tight structuring, part of that is just the narrative constraints that the setting imposes. And part of it is that the system is relatively lightweight. Like, you're not going to deal with as many, mechanical arguments as you will with Mage. That's just true of every game, though.
Yeah.
You're going to have fewer mechanical arguments than you would with the World of Darkness in general. Mm-hmm. There's fewer stats. There's less, well, is this really command? Should it be, this other thing instead? It's like you're telling someone to do something. Yeah, but I'm using this other thing to do it. You're telling someone to do something, roll command, deal with it, move on. It's also very resilient for skinning in that way. Like, okay, your character has a high level of command. Maybe they get that by hypnosis. Maybe they're just a persuasive person. Maybe they just have a very strong, I will beat the crap out of you if you don't do what I say attitude. That's entirely up to you.
I do appreciate, though, that Charles talked about reskinning. Forged in the Dark is a system a number of people have built on top of it. One of my favorite stats is, so you have the 12 key stats in this game. For Scum and Villainy, they looked at a lot of science fiction movies, and they found out that characters aren't necessarily fast so much as they frequently need to suddenly flee from a place as something bad happens. So one of the stats in that game is scurry. And I appreciate that. That scrabbling away from something that's about to explode is a very common thing. And the game lets you say, no, I am not using command. I am trying to manipulate them. And the storyteller can be like, yeah, that's just not going to be as effective. So you can roll that dice pool, but it's going to be with limited effect. And that to me also cuts out a lot of arguments when people who are like, I'm going to meditate the bullet into him. And you're like, wait, what? And there's frequently
it is very important that I roll appearance plus firearms for this dice.
Exactly.
Because that's where I have all my dots.
Exactly. I need to roll 10 dice. And this game lets you do that, but instead of just changing difficulty, it reduces the effect. We're not going to get into position and effect and kind of how that sets it up.
That's the details.
But so mission-based play is another way it does this, where you have an area that kind of gives you activities that you can do. Part of the setup of the game is you set up a base, you have a lair, you have a hideout, you slowly expand it over time. What to you are some cases where you can have mission-based play that fits into Mage, where it would be reasonable that you have a string of kind of small quests and activities that need to be done that aren't just your mentor telling you to do something?
On the one hand, we're talking about mission-based play, but to me, the part of this package of ideas, because again, it's hard to extricate them, is stuff like the layers and control of territory and all of that. That's the stuff that struck me as being the most portable to Mage. And again, it fits into this mission-based structure very naturally. So, for instance, one thing I would want to do with territory to handle the Ascension War is, well, that seems like a really good model for reality zones. And then your mission-based play is going to be things like shifting the reality zone of like this spot of territory, which may be like a building, probably not a whole city block, definitely more than what a mission really is in this context. Like, you've got your Chantry as your lair, and you're going out into the surrounding area and making people believe in your stuff. That's a mission that mages would have. It's, you go to a place and do a thing. It can fit into 2 to 4 hours, and and if you don't feel like, well, one mission is going to shift this, you then can put a tracker on it or whatever. And a very good way of simulating that sort of stuff.
And to me, kind of the important part about a mission is that there should be something that you come out the other end of with a clear, we got this for doing this. As Charles says, you change the reality zone. Everything you do in that area is now -1 difficulty, or it is not considered vulgar with witnesses or something like that, or you create a new type of vulgarity.
Another system that they have is the strong and weak hold. You could use that or an expanded version of that for various benefits you get as you shift reality zones around.
So hold refers to how secure your claim on something is. If something is strong, it can take a blow to it. Another party could do some sort of activity to weaken your hold of it, and you would still have it. If it is weak and then you lose hold, it is no longer yours and it can become contested. So other groups that kind of have mission-based play. You could be the sentinels that are part of a larger chantry. You could be a group of apprentices going for membership. You could be active simply in a city, and each session involves you clearing out infernalist taint from a particular area or co-opting an enemy. The important part to me is at the end of every session, there should be something that clearly goes on the character sheet that represents this triumph or this setback. You get a dot of contacts, or you get a 1-point node, or you get a something, and your power in the world is represented by cobbling together all of these little things. A mission in general, or unless everyone agrees to it, is not going to be, I got emotional closure with the shadow of my former apprentice who died due to my missing actions. That can certainly happen, but to me, in a proper session, you get a thing out the other end. And it may just be something where every time you complete a mission, you get 3 to 5 willpower back, representing the fact that you're like, yeah, we did the thing, or you free up quintessence or something like that.
Yeah, the only quibble I have with that is maybe it doesn't go necessarily on the character sheet, because getting another small area where, say, your magic is coincidental because everyone believes in you because of the reality zone shift, that's a huge win, and it doesn't really have anywhere on the character sheet to go because it's not a thing about your character, it's a thing about the location that you have changed, and that's also valid.
Yes, there should be a clear mechanical or narrative benefit that occurred out of the session. There should be an external benefit to it, yeah.
This just reminded me, another thing I liked is having group character sheet, which is also a good place where you could keep track of things like, oh, this is our reality zone that we have cobbled together out of our weird paradigms, say.
A thing that happens in a lot of games now is that that everyone comes to the table with a character, and then there is a session whereby you do the character building or the character creation for the team. In this case, it is your crew or your gang. In Invisible Sun, it is your neighborhoods. Blades in the Dark and Invisible Sun kind of being my two favorite non-mage games.
I'm very tempted to just put together a Storyteller's Vault pamphlet, Cabal character sheets. As I said, I'm really interested in the faction game part and the territory, as I think that's one of the places that Mage has not historically been strong, handling things like the paradigms of places. Now, M20 gave us the term reality zone, which has been very helpful for talking about this gap. Now, if it had given us mechanics for reality zones, that would have been great. But
much like Quiet and Domain, fascinating ideas that we get no information on. So in addition to that, we now have the idea that we have the Disparate Alliance, which can be a new quest-giving organization in your game. The Technocratic Union is the one that, to me, falls most easily into this. What are some other groups that you feel could give these regular stream of little activities that have obvious rewards?
And to me, it's sort of any organization whatsoever that you could join. Like, yeah, maybe there's not much hierarchy in the Dream Speakers, but there are respected Dream Speakers who, when they say, this is a thing that should happen, other people are like, okay, I guess I'll go do that.
Yes. Likewise with the Euthanatoi.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe Senex isn't going to order you to go do this, but if Senex says, that guy probably needs to die, that guy's going to die.
There's a lot of people get up and scrabble towards the door all at the same time when Master Senex says that. In Sorceress games or Mortals games, the Arcanum, there are certainly artifacts that you're going to get or contacts that you need to make or groups that you need to rediscover or areas that competing mystical societies want. But just about any place, your spirit patron could give you a regular stream of activities to do, one of the Umbral Courts, and it's one of those things that as you play, you accrue territory and contacts that give you more ideas of what you could do. So this is a Rolodex that just kind of extends on itself, and that I like.
Yeah, and one of the ways I run Mage, the characters tend to get more and more enmeshed into more and more organizations and structures over time. And not always mage or even human organizations. Like as Umbral Courts are a very common one because my games tend to involve the Umbra a decent amount. And then there's always the fun of, well, you've got a mission from Zeus and a mission from Thor, and they contradict each other because they have similar interests in thunder, but they're not allies or anything. Yeah, pick your mission carefully.
So let's next talk about another key mechanic that we have, how to grow your crew. The game talks about starting with a lair. This is a base of operation. I would call this a 0-point chantry. It is just a place you can get to. And as part of crew creation, you figure out what that first point is. Is it cool because it's hidden? Is it well defended? Does it give you access to a special resource? And to me, this is a thing where, okay, our group gets together. We have this abandoned Popeyes that we have access to. What is the one thing that separates it from all other abandoned Popeyes? What is the one cool thing that makes this special? Is there a ghost here that is helpful to it? And basically you get to pick one thing that you're good at doing there, one resource this place provides, one thing that makes this place a good place to recover or act as a bolt hole, or otherwise what kind of separates it from just working out of your parents' basement. As you do scores, some of the score types you have can expand on that, where it's like the goal for this score, we're going to do a favor for the ghost that happens to live in our basement who said that if we settle this score from when they are alive, they are going to provide supernatural shrouding for this place. People will just walk by thinking that there's nothing interesting happening there.
If you don't mind me borrowing from a second game.
Dun dun dun.
In Chronicles of Darkness, ghosts have ranks from 1 to 10, kind of like spirits. And maybe you increase the power of the ghost, and in exchange, it's now your node guardian.
Mm-hmm.
Be careful, because if you get that ghost to like rank 8 or 9, you might have some problems. But that's life in the Chronicles of Darkness setting, and one of the better things to import into World of Darkness, honestly.
The other thing that you can do is, as time goes on, not only do you improve your lair, but you make claims. You have a territory, a region, an area. For a mage game, these don't need to be geographically connected, although in Blades in the Dark it is. The idea is this is a city that is constantly enmeshed in gang turf wars, and every time you take something, it is probably from somebody else. There is comparatively little abandoned place in Duskvol unless there's a really strong reason that nobody goes there. Maybe Haliakaran, the Blood Feaster, still has a small cult operating in the area, and there's a reason why the Foghounds and the Red Hooks never have tried to take over that territory.
I'd argue that's not really unclaimed, because cult is one of the types of groups you can have in Blades in the Dark.
Yeah. It is just the fact that it is not necessarily formally recognized as part of the faction game that exists within it. But every spot is claimed by someone, or there's a darn good reason why there's no one there. In Mage, this could represent areas your group's controls, such as expanding their activities into adjoining places, and this should represent gaining backgrounds. You become established in a neighborhood as generally respected good guys, and you gain a dot or two of contacts. You gain the favor of local emergency services and gain allies or backup, or it reduces recovery time. You recover a ley line, netting you a 1-point node.
I would definitely look at this, and instead of taking it as being necessarily geographic area, or even just non-geographic locations, I would treat it more as a conceptual mission space. That could be turf, but on the other hand, it could be a spot that you are, if you claim it, you are improving the health of your node. You said claiming a ley line, or you are building influence with EMTs and making it easier for them to do their jobs, and so on. But the general structure of there's some network of things, you move along it in order to improve various parts of your chantry and the surrounding areas. Not on the podcast, but we've talked a lot about how Mage really has lacked mechanics for doing things like actually changing the world. Then Blades in the Dark comes along and is like, here they are.
Yes. The other thing, this can also literally be a base building exercise where in a construct or amalgam or chantry game, each technocratic score you make gives you access to something. You've proven to your superiors that you're allowed to have more resources dedicated to you. The areas can be real or abstract. You can literally gain access to the machine shop, which will let you repair vehicles or devices, or abstract it away and say that all cybernetic or android characters recover one level of health each day, or building clocks can go faster. This can also apply to large areas like realms. This can apply to larger areas like realms where either it is slow to explore or the realm needs to allow you to be there. There may be a secondary pericarp within a realm, another barrier that prohibits characters from entering the pool of remembrance, which eases mindscape rolls, which can be accessed by clearing out the Avernian moles from the garrison region. So there are ways that you can represent this in a literal sense, especially if you're in a large organization where you need to do something good to gain access to the library, or in a notional sense where you say, hey, the benefit that we're abstracting away of this region is that we get one of those backgrounds. We made mention to clocks. Another key technology that you can just shove into your game and no one will probably notice is clocks, which are a basic type of tracker that says when this clock is finished, something will happen. At the simple level, this can help track time, but it can also track something narratively. I like clocks in that they allow you to have several types of problem solving contribute to an event without one being a blowout. A mage may be recovering from quiet, which has a 6-segment clock. They automatically advance one segment every month as they just kind of deal with stuff, but assistance can speed this up. A successful seeking could add another segment. Assistance from a master of mind could add yet another segment. So the group kind of gets to pick how fast they want to go. If there's a group session exploring the mindscape, that could move it yet further. And when the clock is complete, the person leaves quiet. Clocks generally have an idea that something in the background will cause them to advance, and you can either speed it up or slow it down. They also work across scales. It could represent healing from an injury, where segments are added for time, rest, and magic, or they could represent vast changes. The clock can represent Kalamakli waking, who, when they rise, will shatter the sanity of the entire city. A character may choose to die to prevent the addition of a segment to that clock. For me, clocks kind of help do two things. One, they set up consequences for failure and create tension. Characters are breaking into the house of a sleeping vampire near sunset. Instead of coming up with an arbitrary point where the vampire wakes or waiting for someone to botch, I set up a 6-segment clock called Vampire Wakes. As the characters explore the house, I can advance the clock every 15 minutes or so in narrative time, but I can also make it a consequence for failure. A character moving across a creaky floor rolls perception plus athletics or dexterity plus streetwise. A failure may result in a segment being marked, or 2 if they botch. And to me, having those physical manifestations, physical in the sense that I draw it out on some area that people can see, I think increases the tension rather than people just vaguely knowing in the background that that is something the storyteller has at their disposal.
It also has a really nice advantage for the storyteller in that you don't necessarily have to come up with new problems that for every botch. There's the storytellers who like to plan and the storytellers who like to think on their feet. And if you're a planner and then someone botches in a way you weren't expecting, you're gonna have an evening.
For me, I like clocks in that they kind of quantize effort or dump it into buckets. So your character wants to hound someone until they divulge a piece of information. You could say anyone can roll any stat they want. Once you have 10 successes, they spill it. Meaning a person with twice the dice pool is probably twice as useful. And then we kind of get into min-maxing territory. Turning that into a clock where there's 4 segments, where your super manipulative person doesn't get to dominate because their 6 successes only net them 1 segment, whereas someone else doing subtle harassment or something like that is still equally effective. It may be a case where an extraordinary effort or an extraordinary success of 5 or 6 successes may add 2, but it prevents a single character blowout. And it depends what kind of game you want. Do you want characters to be all-stars, or do you want everyone to be able to help?
One thing it does is it often makes public knowledge something that had been private ST knowledge previous. Like, I think most STs at some point have, well, this will happen after, this number of, like, it's this threshold number of successes and whatnot. And I'm rolling every so often or whatever, and I'm doing it behind the screen. Players don't know how far along it is and so on. And while there is some value in there's often value in that the players don't know how close something is to happening. A lot of the time you get more tension from them knowing exactly how close it is, and having this tool in your kit so that you can make that choice on a case by case basis is very useful.
I like the fact that they allow you to kind of create like a little dashboard of all the things happening in the world, depending on what you choose to share with them. I generally have a common sheet with all the long-term projects going on. And to me, the clock level is kind of something that is narratively appropriate, where you have a vague idea that this big thing is going to happen in 6 segments. You can kind of say, this is, we're at the beginning, we're at the middle, we're at the end, as kind of a guess. Clocks also let you treat different inputs differently. For instance, it is common for me to say the first time you try a new approach to a particularly large problem, it gets a free segment. So it just kind of rewards some diversity of effort. 8-segment clock to research the umbral origins of a spirit mold may give a extra segment whenever a new way of tackling that happens. Taxung has mostly been talking to nature spirits, but their chantry mate recommends using the rote manifest roots to track the mold across space-time by combining life, spirit, correspondence, and time. This new strategy yields some immediate results. It's worth 2 segments. It justifies talking with someone else and maybe encourages someone to diversify the spheres they have. Charles, in a mage game, where do you see clocks as being potentially useful? Are there some examples?
So you mentioned big projects. I tend to like to encourage things like building wonders or other sort of legacy projects for mages. Mages are people. They want to leave something behind also. They don't want to die. That's part of why you get liches, Tremere, and all sorts of other horrible things like Porthos. Mages do want to leave a legacy. They want to leave things permanently affected by their presence. So these big projects are great for clocks. Every single countdown, but that's every game. And
to me, there are things that are hard, that are time consuming, but not necessarily difficult or impossible. Researching someone's true name. Poignant Spring is searching for clues to the set of karmic stains that acts as the true name for Sanguine Bounty, their infernalist foe. I set a 6-segment clock in each month of plumbing the Akashic Record, or looking through mundane information yields a segment. Later on, they find Sanguine Bounty's Roll of Honorous Deeds, which they use to join House Hong Lei, and that counts as 2 segments. They represent things that characters can choose to accelerate with effort, such as healing or training or finding something through an information network. It's useful for establishing a background. Marguerite hypothesizes that her mentor is still alive in entropic space and merely needs to be contacted. I set up a 6-segment clock where each segment occurs from a week of downtime or some plot advancement. Finding the specific date and time of their apparent death is a segment. Contact with a master of the shroud is worth another segment, and so on. Once complete, Marguerite adds 1 dot of mentor or spirit patron to their character sheet, and further clocks can be used to improve this.
one place that just clocks slot in perfectly easily into World of Darkness games in general is the tug of war clock. If you've got 2 characters competing to accomplish something, or one's trying to do something and the other's trying to prevent them from doing it, put a clock down. One of them is adding segments, the other one's subtracting segments, and now everyone knows where everything stands, and your brain is freed up to actually focus on the narrative and adjudicating all of the magic rules.
I frequently use them as kind of a race where you and someone else are both searching for the same thing. Say they have a clock and you have a clock, and you both have an idea of where the other person is doing. So whenever it's 2 people going for the same thing, I also think there is something, at least in my games, a little bit dramatic in the act of drawing the clock. So generally I draw the cross segments and then draw a circle around it. And whenever I go for that, people are like, oh, what's about to happen? They're like, Terry's drawing a clock. And there is something about that ritual that I kind of enjoy.
Blaze in the Dark discusses linked clocks, and that made me think that you could kind of outline an entire session as a sequence of clocks that depend on each other like that. Like, we're mostly talking about how you could use them at the table, but they're also a good outlining tool for again, it depends on whether you're a preparation type of ST or the players are going to do stuff, I can't predict it, I'm just going to fly by the seat of my pants kind of ST.
And for me, in closing, clocks can fit in any game. They are a narrative tool, and they're a good abstraction, I think.
They're one of the most modular pieces of Blades in the Dark. You can just slip them into, as you said, you can slip them into any game and it works.
Do you want to talk about the faction game next then?
Like, we've been talking about the faction game, kinda.
There are 2 parts of the faction game in Blades in the Dark. As I mentioned earlier, just about every entity in the world that is of note is tied to a faction, some sort of group, or they are so powerful that they unto themselves are a faction. And factions have relationships with one another. They pursue agendas against one another. They pursue territory and other actions. So the faction game brings together a whole bunch of things. One is the idea that you have status with various factions, that within a city there could be multiple chantries or multiple supernatural groups, and as you do things that advance or discourage their agenda, you gain or lose status with them, which is kind of broken up into they are neutral at +1. They will help you if it causes no problems or no cost to them. At +2, it is friendly. They will help you if it doesn't create serious problems, but they expect that you will do the same. And at +3, you are allies. They will help you even if it's not in their best interest, but they expect you to do the same. And to me, this is something that doesn't need to be tied to a faction. It can be tied to a particularly notable character. And this is a way of explaining how that works. It is also a good way of saying when you draw out the full network that as you become allies, you care about the contacts of your contacts. At the lower level, it's just you and them. At the higher levels, though, they're going to start calling in favors because you've probably called in favors. And just about every action you do will gain you status with someone and cause you to lose status with someone else. The thing I like about this is this creates a potential avenue for upsides of failure. Where, yeah, you know the way we were supposed to do this infiltration, it was supposed to be all sneaky-like, and then it went utterly sideways and we blew up the fire station? Well, it turns out this group is now super happy that we did this. The vampires are now saddened that there are more sources of fire within the city, but on the flip side, the mages of the Eternal Flame are thrilled by this.
On the flip side, it was really weird getting high-fived by a werewolf.
Yeah. This gives you just another thing to play with, where you get to say, you can refuse this mission, but you are going to go from ally to friendly with this group. Or you took this mission from this other group. The Euthanatoi are not very happy that you have taken up a mission for the Licks or the Fellowship of Eternal Life or something like that.
Another aspect of it, because you mostly talked about the positive side of things, is on the negative side, at -3, you're at war. This is also a great way to simulate that city on the brink of the Ascension War turning hot. Like you hit that -3 with the Technocracy and you've called that, and that's not good for you. That it's an extra way to do it in addition to heat.
Mm-hmm. It is also one of those things where this allows you to mechanize your claims, where you could say there is an upstart group within the city, an upstart chantry trying to establish itself. And as an act of political courtesy, you say, hey, this is an area that we've generally looked over. How about you take care of it? And maybe it's one of those things where it's actually been more trouble than it's worth. Maybe there's more ghosts in that area than you really thought, or that homeowners association is real D-bags, and you hand over the claim, but in exchange, you immediately go to friendly with them, or you gain 2 dots of allies. It allows you to mechanize things in a way that I find very powerful because it makes a lot of the things that happen in the game real and persistent. I've been in a lot of games where I thought I did a favor for an NPC, and in the eyes of the storyteller, that didn't mean anything, and I never got to call upon it, and I kind of felt like a chump. But adding an optional mechanics layer lets you make those things all real.
Yeah, to shift to a different aspect of the faction game. So you mentioned you're new, you've got a little chantry, you can't handle very much. How about you take over this area that's ours. The faction game also has the concept of tier, about how big your crew is in Blades in the Dark. In Mage, that could just easily be how powerful your group is in a more abstract sense. But it also means, say, as you move up the tiers, this might just be because I've been reading literature about medieval government recently. And okay, so that new group is essentially your vassal. Like maybe over time they're merged into your crew. You get them to that +3 alliance for a while. You're higher tier than them. It's not hard to see how that could flow together. And this also means that you then if you're operating at a higher tier, you don't have time for, like, if you're a tier 4, that's in Blades in the Dark, a huge gang, 40 people. Let's just say the tiers are 1 less than your arete. So, tier 0, you're talking Arete 1, 1 to 2, or 1 to 2 people. It's like you can't do very much. So you're dealing with like lost spectral cats or something. But you get the attention of someone who's tier 3. So that's like Arete 4. These are some movers and shakers. They're not the most powerful people around. They're not masters and archmages. But these are mentors, these are patrons, and yeah, eventually you get integrated into their chantry, but they don't have time to deal with this missing spectral cat. And maybe that missing cat is actually a problem that could escalate if it's not resolved. Someone needs to deal with it. People with mind 4 are not going to be dealing with that problem until it has gotten bad. So your job is to deal with the small things that they don't have time for now. Or your job is to delegate the small things to other groups, depending on which side of this divide you're on. I found the gang scale by tier to be a very useful thing, and there's rules for like increasing your tier, which don't quite line up with calling tier, Arete -1.
It would be kind of like if Dice Pool, Arete, and backgrounds all kind of moved roughly in unison. Your tier determines the quality level of your stuff. So, for instance, a tier 1 gang has tier 1 equipment, which does well against other tier 1 equipment. So tier 1 lockpick is a good match for a tier 1 lock. So one of the things that happens in the game, one of the crew upgrades you can get is generally your items are of high quality. They are a tier above what your actual tier is. So if you're a B&E group, your demolition tools, your disguises, and your lockpicks are all one level higher than your tier. So if you start out at tier 0, you have all tier 1 stuff. If you start out at tier 1, you have all tier 2 stuff. And it creates a very easy way to compare how good you are about going up to other things. Tier could be used to abstract away what are the general dice pools. You could say something like tier times 2 plus 1 is the average dice pool you will be going up against for a group, where it's like, well, we're breaking into a tier 3 house. What are their defensive systems? Tier times 2 plus 1. Okay, you're rolling against 7 dice. Or something like that. Or the number of successes you need could just be equal to their tier level or something like that. And it hands out a handy abstraction. And I like Charles' idea that it gives you an idea of who reports to who in terms of what relationship. Where it's one of those things where, like within a technocratic construct, you have the armature who is tier 3, who shops out things to their cohort, which are generally tier 2, which goes out to maybe elite ciphers, which are tier 1, and then sympathizers, which are all tier 0. And that allows you to kind of quickly get an idea of relative power as well as to see how things flow. It also makes it easy to say, going 1 above your level is daring. Going 2 above your level is probably foolhardy.
Again, to use the Arete comparison, if you're Arete 3, yeah, your Cabal can probably stretch and handle like one guy at Arete 4, but you're going to have a hard time in a magical confrontation with a master. And it ties into all the other stuff we've talked about. I really recommend reading through, actually looking through the mechanics. I haven't read the Forged in the Dark SRD, just Blades in the Dark. Like this whole section with faction game, tiers, status, claims, territory, all of this is really the part of the game that grabbed me.
Mm-hmm. And it is interesting because it allows you to integrate that faction game. There is something called a faction turn or faction round that could occur where any faction you've introduced, you roll some dice and you advance their individual clocks. And this is one of those things where the Nefandi need to push through new ordinances that allow for a certain type of construction, which will allow them to finish directing quintessence to a particular place. Or the technocrats are trying to rebuild a gateway to get a lost Quile machine or something like that. So during the downtime, you can roll for all of these, advance the world, and introduce rumors into your game that generate that kind of background activity. That is useful in that it can generate kind of just quest hooks to be like, oh, you've heard rumors that this gateway is really close to getting back online. And that could be an option for a score that your characters do. It also creates a sense that the world is alive outside of it, that sometimes video games are very good at making it feel like you are stepping into a world. And in other video games, it is clear that everyone was just waiting for you to arrive. And sometimes you want one, sometimes you want the other, but it's really awkward when you get one and expected the other. So, and this is a way to make that world seem more alive without having to do the thing of like, oh, what would the progenitors have been doing here? Which some people like.
So Heat. So how does heat work, Terry?
Heat is a system whereby the game recognizes the amount of notoriety and hubbub that a group generates in the course of pursuing their daring deeds and such. When it goes above a certain point, it increases the group's wanted level, and these two combined indicate how actively the Bluecoats, the police of Duskvol, are looking for them and what happens when they are encountered. Heat can be removed by lying low or by bribery, but removing levels of wanted require much more concerted action, such as going to prison, which is also a mini game in this. You can have a group that, much like the Kingpin, is at their most powerful when they are in jail, or any number of other cases where like a drug magnate or something was like that. I have toyed around with a mage version of this where there is a tracker for the Technocracy called Notice. Vulgar with Witnesses magic automatically generates a point of notice, or Vulgar without Witnesses effects of sufficient size that someone could later stumble upon. This is useful in that, again, this gives you a way of creating a messy success or of having a botch. You go out to your information network and say, hey, I'm looking for information on the fronts for this construct. And I can say, hey, you failed. You can succeed, but generate notice. Or you can just fail. Or alternatively, you botched, you generate notice, and you still haven't gotten information. This can represent the attention of any powerful entity in the game. This could represent the Court of the Tower or the Court of Dreams. It could represent a totem brood. It could represent a notable Nefandus. It could represent strictly mortals. Notice, if you get enough points of it, gets turned into a level of interest or surveillance. At Surveillance 0, most technocrats will politely ignore what you're doing if they have something better to do. At Surveillance 1, technocrats will react negatively to things done in their presence, but not care about things that are just rumors. At Surveillance 2, the Technocracy actively seeks you out, and mortal news organizations may be onto the characters, or it could be the other way around, where mortal news organizations have noticed you as an actor, and that has gotten the Technocracy's attention. At Surveillance 3, the characters are actively being searched for with mundane assets. The police have been notified with any information the Technocracy has. And at Surveillance 4, Manar, Quintessence Hounds, and other tools start coming out. Your surveillance level is generally known, so an ally may only be willing to work with you if you keep your surveillance at 1 or lower because they want to stay off the radar too.
And just be wary of getting to Surveillance 5. That's basically Ravnos Antediluvian.
There's something in the sky actively looking for you, and it has the power to channel the essence of the sun. So
really a good time to not only lay low, but to lay low off-world.
Yeah. Heat is useful because it can also apply to outcomes. You get heat if you pull off a heist against a particularly powerful target, or if you kill someone, or if you destroy something notable, or otherwise make your presence excessively known. If your mage game is a game about war in shadows, something like heat represents the degree to which you keep things in the dark. In some cases, your bravado will be recognized, but mostly it just marks you as sloppy. Where do you see heat fitting into a mage game, or something similar, if anywhere?
Fairly similarly to you, just heat, as you said, might have impact on things like status with various groups. Like, yeah, that hollow one may want to only hang out with you if you have surveillance 2, like 1 or less. But that tough Tani is going to respect you at surveillance 3 and 4.
Yeah.
Depending on who you have to work with, you might have to really start manipulating your heat and surveillance levels in order to get them to do things for you, which is an interesting dynamic that isn't explicitly there in World of Darkness, but is kind of, it's one of the things that's under the surface, and using this mechanic brings it up and makes it more accessible.
2 other mechanics that I enjoy using are load and flashbacks. The first one, load, is instead of stating what your character is carrying around, you simply choose the amount of load that you're having for a score. You indicate if you're taking a little stuff, so you blend in a normal amount of stuff, which may get you noticed if someone is looking for you, or I'm taking a lot of stuff and it really sticks out. Load avoids figuring out what you're bringing, as each item has a load size, and as you need something, you merely say, hey, this load on my character sheet was for this thing. As you advance, some items take up less space. Your group may get advanced thieving tools or demolition equipment or arcane concoctions that take up less space or easily hideable or just kind of associated with your group, so you always have them. Load lets you respond immediately to threats. In the game, you can always blow 2 load to have armor or 5 load to have heavy armor, which I particularly like. Harm in this game, since there are so many ways to avoid what a storyteller is having do to you when you do get the level of experiencing harm, it is powerful, and it is difficult to recover from. So this is useful because if you're face down with someone pointing a shotgun at you in the opening scene, you can always say, good thing I have my heavy armor on, avoid that problem, but have to deal with it later. Load itself is kind of a mix between like physical size and narrative effect. Heavy armor takes up 5 load, whereas that would be enough space in terms of raw volume for several barrels of crowbars and sledgehammers. Avoiding harm is powerful, so it costs a bunch of load. Breaking open a door is also useful, but generally not as vital to a game, so the amount of load it takes is generally a little bit lower. Another key technology that we have are flashbacks. They are a way to insert bits into a narrative that are intended to avoid lengthy setups. Again, the game wants you to start playing as soon as possible. They cannot directly contradict what has happened so far. A flashback cannot remove the revolver from the guard holding you at gunpoint, but it can remove the bullets from the barrel. Flashbacks consume stress, which is a common resource in the game. A 0-point flashback is an obvious setup action or taking advantage of a resource that you would be highly likely to use. Asking your friend who works at a bank what their common security precautions are would be a 0-point flashback that could do something useful within the game. Flashbacks increase in cost the more contrived they are. A flashback to set up a character drugging a guard at a security shack outside of a factory would likely be a 1-point flashback, while a flashback to having planted an emergency escape in a newly built building during its construction could be a 3-point flashback or possibly impossible. In Mage, allows 0-point flashbacks to explain why somebody can do something off the cuff and it isn't fast casting. I ask the player to explain how they've done a similar effect previously. And if they can, it is not considered fast casting. If they can't, they get that +1 difficulty thing. Flashbacks and load are kind of built together.
Yeah, to me, they're two aspects of something that Mage is one of the places where Mage says things, but then doesn't back them up very well directly, which is a smart mage is a prepared mage, but the player doesn't have all the context of the world. So how do you manage that? And both of these are ways for you to say, well, the character prepared, I don't know what they needed as well as they would until I'm actually in the scene. Whether it's equipment-based or preparation-based, I am a huge fan of both of them, and I will just explicitly say, reduce the level of flashback by 1 for each dot of time that you're using. And now you've suddenly got a very good system for handling, I looked forward to see what I was going to need to do. I have used systems very similar to the flashback system for characters who have the ability to alter the past in small ways. Again, the requirement is always you don't contradict anything that's been said so far, but whatever happens next, you can mess with.
Or you could justify why something isn't quite as impactful as it is, or it allows you to, for instance, dodge something that no one else can. A thing I've thought about in Mage is I love flavorful uses of foci, but they frequently require a lot of planning ahead of time. And I don't always want that A-team scene of everyone like stocking up, or otherwise I get to this ridiculous thing where people have like their backpack full of foci. So I have 2 things that I'm toying about adding: mundane preparedness and arcane preparedness. A character who has chosen high levels of arcane preparedness, they get access to more focusy stuff as they play. Again, this is generally not a statement necessarily about size. For instance, if your Verbena always has a cauldron with them, that's 1 load, even though it is a darn cauldron. We will come up with a way to justify it.
There's little hand cauldrons that you can
DIY porta cauldrons. Yeah.
I'm saying you can like go to a store and buy a cauldron that's like 3 inches diameter.
Oh yeah, in the same way that there are backpacking Dutch ovens that blew my mind when I found out that they existed. So your cauldron may be 1 load, whereas a small slip of silver blessed on a full moon may be load 3, because the odds of you knowing that you needed that ahead of time are kind of low.
But again, I would allow you to decrease the rating of load or the flashback if you are actively using time magic.
Yeah. If you're actively using time, if you did a lot of research ahead of time.
Yep. There's lots of ways to reduce these levels in order to be more prepared. Yep. And one of the things that Mage does constantly sort of say and imply in between the lines is a prepared mage is a powerful mage. But again, the player isn't living and breathing this world. So you aren't actually going to be able to do the cost benefit of analysis on, should I take silver bullets with me, the way that your character would. But when you're in a scene and a werewolf jumps out at you, say, okay, that's like 3 load. I've got silver bullets, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that is a great way of doing it. And I like Charles' idea of saying, hey, one of the powers of time is the fact that it reduces the load cost of these things. Or alternatively, no one gets load unless you have time correspondent spirit or something like that, some sort of scrying that you can do. And suddenly now you have points of load that can be justified.
Now I'm thinking of a load rating for each sphere. Like how prepared you are to handle problems of that sphere. But even if I don't want to go that complicated, the spheres that would reduce load and flashback costs and so on are time and entropy.
Yeah.
Because that's what they're there for. Correspondence to a lesser extent because you're information gathering. But like I could justify reducing load with almost any sphere if I'm like oh, like you can't reduce load with matter. Oh, of course you can reduce load with matter.
Yeah. Or alternatively, matter allows you to generate more load.
You can increase your load capacity with matter.
Mm-hmm. It is a useful system. Other games have something similar. Gumshoe has a preparedness stat that allows you to do it. The important thing to me about using load is that the table kind of agree on what it represents vaguely. Is it pure size? Is it narrative? And that once it is introduced, there is not a random element to it. One of the things I hate about the requisitions background is that you have to roll it. And the probabilities to set up an M20 make it generally worse than just having those other backgrounds and then trading for what you need. To me, it's one of those things where it's like, no, you have access to 3 load, go nuts. And the real game is saying, okay, how do I want to spend this? I don't know what's going to happen in this session. Do I really want to give us an easy win early on and just reduce the total amount of friction? Or when I discover that there's a sleeping Methuselah at the end of it, do I want to be able to have just the right thing at just the right time?
One thing that's very important to remember, and this, I admit, did slow me down a little bit on my reading, load's not encumbrance. These are not encumbrance rules for anything. Don't treat them that way. That is reducing how useful they are.
So I have loved Blades in the Dark. It has changed the way I thought about games. The fact that everything is tight and interconnected in a certain way is kind of a hallmark of John Harper games. If anyone has heard me talk about Agon, it does kind of the same thing, but introduces, I think, the coolest dice building mechanic I have ever experienced, where you just like roll off your list of deeds and how amazing you are and then roll everything. But Blades in the Dark is a wonderful game. There's a lot of tools that are available online for free, and it kind of set a benchmark as to how much value you can get out of a game for the low cost of $19.99 or $24.99 for the PDF. If you haven't given it a try, please do. It is highly integrated into Roll20. There are a lot of Roll20 modules for it, where you just have entire maps of Duskvol and everything. It doesn't use tactical movement or anything like that. You don't need miniatures. It does involve a little bit of negotiation and to figure out like what skill applies. The idea of setting position and effect is something that takes a little bit of skill to use and difficulty to establish. But yeah, I absolutely love this. This is a case where if I were to pick one other game to steal things from, it would probably be Blades in the Dark. Charles, do you have any other thoughts on Blades in the Dark or Blades in Mage?
I agree. It's a very tightly built game. I read a lot of gaming books with the idea of, is there something here I can use in Mage? Because most of the time I'm running Mage. Honestly, usually the answer is, oh, this would be nifty to use in Mage, and then I just never think about it again. Blaze of the Dark isn't doing that. There's things in here that even just before we started recording, Terry and I were bouncing ideas back and forth a little bit about some of these things being adapted as storytellersvault supplements and the like, because there's so much meat here that fits kind of exactly into some of the areas that Mage is weakest.
Sometimes it makes the gameplay feel like a board game, and that is a good thing. There are dozens of Forged in the Dark games, so if you're like, yeah, I kind of like the idea of this game, but I don't want to play it in a steampunk Victorian city protected by lightning barriers, you have Scum and Villainy, Bands of Blades, Girl in Moonlight, Blades Against Darkness, Leviathan Sog, Vigilantes, Court of Blades, Flames Without Shadow. You got a lot of options out there, and I will link to some in the show notes. And now my favorite part of discussions with Charles. So Charles, what do you have coming out for the STV soon?
So just waiting on the last art for Foreign Magics, Binder Spheres for the Nightfolk mages. So that's if your mage is a ghoul or kinfolk or a medium, kinane, how should you represent powers that you get from that? If you are also just playing heavily crossover and you just have a copy of V20 or C20 or whatever next to you, sure, you can just actually use disciplines or whatever. But that's just an extra entire mechanical system grafted on, and that's not always the greatest thing. Friend of the show, Puka G, put out a book on minor spheres, which are something that showed up in the revised storyteller handbook, but then the mage books never actually did anything with them. And Puka expanded the rules and wrote up a bunch of them. And from discussions, I came to the conclusion of, oh, so a ghoul should not have, say, dominate. They should have the sphere of dominance. Kinfolk mages don't get gnosis. They just don't. Like, they kind of get like, as far as like characters who have the kinfolk merit are concerned, they kind of get screwed in that they can't have gnosis, and the gifts are kind of would be really awkward to fit in. But what if they have the sphere of the wild? And I expanded that to a set of 3 minor spheres for crossover with each of the other 4 games that got 20th anniversary editions. Yeah, that's just waiting on some art I commissioned, and then it's ready to go.
Nice. You were discussing the concept before the show, and I think it solves a very real problem, and with a little bit of expansion could just be used to represent all other Nightfolk if you really wanted to.
The only reason I didn't do it for, say, Hunter, Mummy, Demon, and so on is because, well, part of it is project scoping, and because they haven't had 20th anniversary editions, it's a little bit less clean to work with them. And also, I've not read Hunter the Reckoning or Mummy the Resurrection, and I just really don't want to. I was reading Blades in the Dark instead.
Yeah. That is entirely reasonable. And in the meantime, if you would like to see what I believe is Charles' most recent publication, Magickal Capital is also available on the Storyteller Vault. When that comes out, I look forward to talking to you about Minor Spheres. Charles, thank you so much for joining.
Of course.
This has been Mage the Podcast, where if you ever wanted help escaping past the lightning barrier, we totally feed your dog while you were gone. This episode is made possible by Josh Hillerup, Oracle of Summoning Lightning, Real Lightning. Buck Gregory, Oracle of always having heavy armor just below your clothing. Christopher Phillips, Oracle of a flashback within a flashback within a flashback to remember your car keys. The crew of Erebus, Oracle of always taking one stress to help a friend in need. Magickal, Oracle of being able to always have important papers with you, even if it's to prove that you're a licensed banana inspector. Jay Widener, Oracle of saying the game's name in theatrical sense like going, Mage! Oh! Additionally, I'd like to thank our other producers, Alex, Alexia, Anders S., Andrew Edelstein, Anand, Badurfi, Berto, Blaze Hibbert, Blake Ryan, Boo, Boogers to the Six, Brad of the Blue, Bryce Perry, Chris B., Daniel Cuppin, Daniel Scribner, Dan Svensson, David Roy, Dennis Osborne, Derek Semsick, Fraggle Rock, Gargle Noir, George Laura, Guy Conan Stewart, Ia Bolt, Jason Kennedy, Jason Vines, Jason W. Briggs, Jeff Bryn, John Magnuson, Jolyn Andes, Joshua Heath, Kathleen Halperin, Chris Kinner, Leslie Weatherstone, Matthew Prohl, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Morgan Aran, Nathan Weaver, Nabero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klaimanov, Oliver Schindler, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Puka G, Rachel Grace, Ralph Scheinhammer, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Rob H., Ryan Candy, Samuel Tobin, Sean Gallagher, Stephen Carton, Thrice Great, William Connolly, William Martin, and Zach Rules. Our EP shoutout this episode is to Morgan Aran. Morgan, in my last Blades in the Dark game, one of the default gangs listed was the Foghounds, and I made every other gang a combination of some sort of atmospheric weather fog-like phenomenon plus a dog term. And this included the Mist Dingoes, the Steam Curs, the Smog Canines, the Haze Puppers, the Broom Doggos, the Gloom Pooches, the Merc Mutts, the Haze Whelps, and when I finally ran out of ideas, the Pea Soup Bitches. May all of your games have better naming conventions, and thank you for your support. Rather listen on YouTube, search Mage the Podcast on YouTube to find our full library there. If you super like this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethepodcast@gmail.com or at magethepodcast on Twitter. We have a hop in Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform of your choosing and tell a friend about us. Also go to magethepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality. Bye.
I did mean like it had killed Skype and then built a house on its corpse.
Although that would be somewhat terrifying if Satiros had the power to be like, yep, this is canon now. Kind of like my attempt to show that there were no Lutherans in the Celestial Chorus, which would be funny to only me. The Goatfield.
People think I only should talk about Mage. That's because they only see me in the Mage the Podcast server.
Uh-huh.
For me, shit talking it's a love language in many ways.
My version of that is people think I only fundamentally don't understand Mage. I fundamentally don't understand a lot of games, but you only hear about it on my Mage podcast, unless you listen to Systematic Understanding of Everything, in which case you've heard me fundamentally misunderstand Exalted as well. Yeah, I should do Mage the Podcast fidget spinners, and that should be like a holiday gift for hosts.
When we started this conversation, I had like 95% battery, and I have 18% now, so I thought I should get a power cord.
Yeah, maybe the microphone is calculating Mersenne primes or something. I don't know, you got me.
This thing better not be crypto mining.